The ledger. To the daughter who truly represents this family's future, my father said, raising his crystal flute toward the chandelier. The ballroom went silent. 200 of New York's elite held their breath. We are transferring the deed to the lakeside estate to Isabella, effective tonight. The applause was deafening. Isabella beamed, clutching her fiancé Nathan's arm, soaking in the adoration. Then came the knife. Because a legacy, my father added, looking directly at me from the podium, belongs to the child who upholds the image. I didn't shatter. I didn't weep. I just took a slow sip of my champagne and smiled because they thought this was a coronation. They didn't know it was an execution. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I placed my empty glass on a passing waiter's tray and turned my back on the podium. I didn't storm out. Storming out is for people who still hope someone will chase them. I walked with the steady, quiet rhythm of a woman closing a business deal that had gone bad. As I moved through the crowd, the applause for Isabella finally began to fade, replaced by the murmur of 200 wealthy guests returning to their conversations. They were drinking the champagne I bought. They were standing under the crystal chandeliers I rented. They were admiring the custom silk gown my sister was wearing, a dress that cost $6,000, paid for with a check from my personal account because my mother said cash flow was a little tight this month. For years, I had been the architect of their illusion. I was the one who balanced the books in the dark so they could shine in the light. I paid the caterers when the credit cards were declined. I covered the venue deposit when my father said his transfers were stuck in clearing. I was the silent partner in the business of being the perfect family. I used to tell myself it was loyalty. That is the trap, isn't it? We tell ourselves we are the strong ones, the reliable ones. But as I walked toward the audiovisual booth at the back of the ballroom, I finally allowed myself to look at the invisible chain that had been choking me for a decade. It is a strange thing, the chain of the survivor. It is not made of iron or steel. It is made of hope. The desperate, pathetic hope that if you just pay one more bill, if you solve one more crisis, if you make them look good just one more time, they will finally look at you and see a daughter instead of a resource. You convince yourself that your utility is the same thing as love. You think that if you make yourself indispensable, you will be safe. But tonight, under these lights, the chain snapped. It didn't break with a noise. Just dissolved. I realized that I wasn't keeping them afloat. I was funding my own erasure. My father's announcement wasn't a sudden betrayal. It was simply the final receipt. He had taken everything I had given him, my money, my silence, my labor, and he had used it to build a pedestal for Isabella. A pedestal built on a foundation of debt that was about to collapse. He thought he was giving her a legacy. He didn't realize he was handing her a grenade. And I was the only one in the room who knew exactly when the pin had been pulled. The presentation. I reached the back of the room. The lighting technician, a young guy in a black headset, looked up at me nervously. He knew the plan. I had hired him to. He nodded, his hand hovering over the control board. On the massive screen behind the stage, a freeze frame of my parents smiling on their wedding day 30 years ago was waiting. It was the cover image for the anniversary montage I had spent weeks curating. The guests were expecting a tear-jerking slideshow of vacations, graduations, and happy memories set to sentimental music. They were expecting the lie. I opened my laptop on the console table. The screen glowed with a different kind of presentation. It wasn't a montage. It was a forensic audit. I looked back at the stage one last time. Joshua and Angela were clinking glasses with the mayor. Isabella was laughing, her head thrown back blissfully, unaware that the deed in her hand was an anchor that would drag her to the bottom of the ocean. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel sad. I felt the cool, clean sensation of absolute clarity. I tapped the technician on the shoulder and plugged my HDMI cable into the main feed. It is time to show them the real cost of doing business. The music cut out first. The sentimental string quartet track that was supposed to accompany 40 years of memories died mid-note, leaving a vacuum of silence in the room. Then the screen flickered. The guests who had been tilting their heads, expecting to see grainy home videos of Isabella's first steps or my parents' wedding vows, leaned in closer. They were confused. They were squinting at the projection, trying to make sense of the stark black and white document that now loomed 20 feet high above the head table. It wasn't a photo. It was a scanned PDF. At the top, in bold, unforgiving letters, it read, "Notice of default." The gasp that went through the room wasn't loud. It was the sound of air being sucked out of the space. It was the sound of 200 wealthy people recognizing a document they had only ever seen across a desk from a desperate client. Never at a black tie gala. I walked out from the shadows of the booth and picked up the wireless microphone from the podium. It felt heavy in my hand, cold and solid. Felt like a gavel. I didn't scream. I didn't let my voice shake. I spoke with the flat, neutral cadence I used in courtrooms when testifying about embezzled funds. I said, "If everyone could please direct their attention to the screens. We have a slight correction to the evening's programming." My father talked about legacy. He talked about image. But I think it is important, especially tonight, to look at the cost of that image. I clicked the remote in my hand. The slide changed. This is where the difference between the picture and the truth becomes violent. We live in a world obsessed with the surface, don't we? We curate, we filter, we crop out the mess. But in forensic accounting we have a saying, the numbers don't have feelings and the numbers don't lie. On the screen a photograph appeared. It was beautiful. My parents and Isabella in Cabo San Lucas, tanned and laughing, holding tropical drinks against a sunset that looked like it had been painted on. It was the definition of the good life. I looked at my mother, Angela. Her hand was over her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that was finally real. I said, "This photo was taken 3 years ago. It garnered 400 likes on social media. It represents the height of the family brand. But let's look at the ledger. Total cost of the trip was $14,000. Source of funds: 3 consecutive missed mortgage payments on the lakeside estate." Clicked again. A split screen appeared. On the left, the photo of the vacation. On the right, the bank statement showing the insufficient funds, fees, and the penalties accumulating on the mortgage. The room was dead silent. You could hear the ice melting in the champagne buckets. Clicked again. A new photo. Isabella beaming, leaning against a white convertible with a red bow on the hood. Her 22nd birthday. I said, "A symbol of freedom, a symbol of status." Reality: this car was not purchased. It was leased using a high-interest home equity line of credit taken out against the very house you were just gifted. The interest rate is 12%. The principal has not been touched in 4 years. The debt has only grown. I looked at Isabella. She wasn't looking at the screen. She was looking at our parents, her face twisting in confusion. She didn't understand yet. She thought this was just cruelty. She didn't realize it was a rescue mission. I clicked the remote one last time. The notice of default returned to the screen, magnified. I said, "And this brings us to the gift. The lakeside estate. My father called it a legacy, but let's call it what it is. The property is currently leveraged for $250,000 in hidden equity loans. It is in active foreclosure. There is a balloon payment of $8,600 due in exactly 60 days. I turned to my sister. She was trembling, clutching Nathan's hand so hard her knuckles were white. I said, "They aren't giving you a house, Isabella. They are giving you a liability. They are transferring the title to you because their credit is ruined, and they need a fresh name to refinance the debt before the bank seizes the property. You aren't the heir. You are the patsy. The fallout." "That's a lie," Angela screamed. Her voice cracked shrill and desperate, shattering the silence in the ballroom. She lunged toward the stage, her expensive heels slipping on the polished floor. "Sydney is lying. She's always been jealous. She's trying to ruin this family because she can't stand to see her sister happy." I didn't flinch. I didn't even look at her. I kept my eyes locked on Isabella. The guests were murmuring now, a low tide of confusion and scandal. But Isabella wasn't looking at the crowd. She was staring at the deed in her hand, then up at the screen where the foreclosure notice still loomed like a tombstone. She looked at the numbers. She looked at the dates. And for the first time in her life, the fog of entitlement cleared. "Is it true?" she whispered. Her voice was small, trembling. "Dad, is it true?" Joshua straightened his tie. He tried to summon the commanding presence he used in boardrooms, but his face was slick with sweat. He looked at Nathan, Isabella's fiancé, whose family owned half the real estate in Connecticut. He looked at the exit. He realized there was no way out, so he did what narcissists always do when they are cornered. He attacked. He slammed his hand on the table. "We did this for you," he roared, pointing a shaking finger at Isabella. "Everything we have done, every loan, every credit line, it was to build this life for you. To make sure you had the right clothes, the right friends, the right image. And this is how you repay us. By questioning us in public." The room recoiled. But I stepped closer to the microphone. This was the moment. This was the lesson. I said, "Listen to him, Isabella. Listen to the logic. He isn't talking about love. He is talking about return on investment. This is the paradox of the golden child, isn't it? You spent your whole life thinking you were the favorite. You thought you were the princess in the castle, but you weren't. You were just the most expensive asset in their portfolio." I looked at the crowd, then back at my father. I said, "Psychologists call it the sunk cost of narcissism. To people like Joshua and Angela, a child is not a human being. Child is a mirror. They poured money into you, Isabella, not because they wanted you to be happy, but because they wanted you to be shiny. They needed you to be the perfect object that proved they were successful. And now that the bill is due, they expect you to pay it. That is why they are giving you the house. Not to shelter you, but because they believe they own you. They believe that because they invested in your image, they are entitled to cash you out." Joshua's face turned a violent shade of purple. "You ungrateful little witch," he shouted at me. "You don't know anything about sacrifice. We gave Isabella the world, and now you want Nathan to pay for it." I shot back, my voice cutting through his rage like a scalpel. I pointed at Nathan, who was standing frozen, his face pale. I said, "That is the plan, isn't it, Dad? You couldn't refinance because your credit score is in the single digits. So you transfer the deed to Isabella. She marries Nathan next month. His name goes on the title. His credit backs the loan. His trust fund pays off your $250,000 debt, and you get to walk away claiming you gave them a generous wedding gift." I turned back to Isabella. She was crying now, silent, horrified tears. I said, "You aren't the heir, Bella. You're the bait. They groomed you to be helpless, to be dependent, to value image over substance, so that when they needed a lifeboat, you wouldn't know how to swim away. They aren't saving you. They are drowning you to keep their heads above water." Angela was sobbing now, loud, theatrical sobs meant to garner sympathy. But no one was moving to comfort her. The guests were staring at her with a mixture of pity and disgust. The illusion of the perfect family hadn't just cracked. It had been exposed as a Ponzi scheme built on the bones of their children. I clicked the remote one more time. The screen went black. Then a new document appeared. I said, "But the house isn't the worst part. The house is just bad business. What comes next is a crime." The title on the slide read, "The Wedding Fund." I said, "This account was opened 18 months ago. Nathan, you wired $50,000 directly to my father to secure the venue deposit and cover the initial catering costs. You trusted them to manage the logistics because they insisted on giving their daughter the perfect day." I looked at Nathan. He was staring at the screen, his jaw tight. He nodded slowly. Clicked the remote. A bank statement appeared. It showed the incoming wire transfer of $50,000 on February 12th. I said, "But look at the next line. February 13th. Outgoing transfer $50,000. Was it sent to the Plaza Hotel? Was it sent to a wedding planner? Well, it was sent to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands." Clicked again. A document of incorporation appeared linking the shell company directly to Joshua. I said, "This company exists for one purpose: to launder gambling debts. My father took your wedding money, Nathan, and he wired it to an offshore sports betting syndicate to cover losses he incurred during the last Super Bowl." The room didn't gasp this time. There was only a collective, horrified intake of breath. "Embezzlement, fraud, theft," I said. "The venue was never paid for with that money." "Paid for it. I wired the deposit myself 3 weeks later when the event coordinator called me saying they were about to release the date. The catering. Paid that too. The flowers. Me. The dress. Me." I turned to my mother. I said, "You let Nathan believe his money was safe. You let Isabella believe her parents were generous. But the truth is you stole from your future son-in-law to cover up your husband's addiction. And you let your other daughter foot the bill to keep the lie alive." Nathan stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. He walked over to Joshua, his face a mask of cold fury. "Where is my money?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Joshua tried to laugh it off, a nervous, sweating chuckle. "Now, Nathan, it's complicated. It was a temporary loan. I was going to pay it back with the equity from the house once Isabella." "So, you stole from me to pay a gambling debt," Nathan interrupted. "And then you plan to use my credit to pay off the house you already mortgaged to the hilt." Joshua stammered. It's finance, son. You understand leverage." "I understand theft," Nathan said. "And I understand fraud." He turned to Isabella. She was weeping silently. The deed to the house crumpled in her hand like a piece of trash. "Bella," he said softly, "did you know?" She looked up, her eyes wide and terrified. "No, I swear, Nathan. I didn't know. They told me. They told me it was a gift." I stepped in. "She didn't know, Nathan. She's not the co-conspirator. She's the mark. They were counting on her being too grateful to ask questions. They were counting on you being too polite to ask for receipts." Nathan looked at me, then back at Joshua and Angela. He pulled his phone from his pocket. "I'm calling the police," he said. "And then I'm calling my lawyers. This wedding is off." "No!" Angela shrieked, lunging toward him. "Nathan, please, we can fix this. It's all a misunderstanding. We're family." "We are not family," Nathan said, stepping back. "You are criminals." The room erupted. Guests were standing up, whispering, pulling out phones. The mayor was hurriedly being escorted out by his security detail. The illusion of the perfect anniversary gala had completely disintegrated. And then, the final crack. Isabella stood up. She walked over to our parents. She didn't look like the spoiled little sister anymore. She looked like someone who had just survived a car crash. She looked at the deed in her hand. Then she looked at Joshua. "You sold me," she whispered. Her voice was shaking, but it was loud enough to be heard over the chaos. "You didn't give me a gift. You sold me to save yourselves." "Isabella, sweetheart," Joshua pleaded, reaching for her. "Don't touch me," she screamed. She threw the deed at his face. The paper fluttered to the floor, landing in a puddle of spilled champagne. "I hate you," she yelled, her voice raw with betrayal. "I hate you for what you did to me. And I hate you for what you did to Sydney." Joshua's face contorted. The mask fell completely. He didn't see a daughter anymore. He saw a failed asset. He saw the ruin of his reputation. He saw the end of his life. He turned toward me. His eyes were wild with rage. "You," he roared. "You ruined everything. You jealous, spiteful witch." He lunged. He cleared the distance between the head table and the podium in seconds, his hands reaching for my throat. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I didn't have to. 2 men in dark suits stepped out from the shadows behind the curtain. They were efficient. They were professional. And like everything else tonight, I had paid for them in advance. One of them caught Joshua's wrist midair. The other secured his shoulder. There was no fight, just the pathetic struggle of a man realizing his authority had evaporated. They escorted him out the side exit, his feet dragging, Angela trailing behind him, wailing about a misunderstanding that no one believed anymore. The ballroom was quiet, the kind of silence that follows a car crash. I looked at Isabella. She was standing alone in the center of the dance floor, surrounded by the wreckage of her engagement and her worldview. She looked at me. There was no hatred in her eyes anymore, just exhaustion, and for the first time recognition. She nodded one small sharp nod. It wasn't a thank you. It was an acknowledgement that the debt was finally cleared. Packed up my laptop. I unplugged the HDMI cable. The screen went black, erasing the evidence, but the truth remained burned into the minds of every person in that room. I walked out the back door into the cool night air of the city. I didn't look back. The ledger was balanced. The balance. 3 months later, the morning sun hit the floorboards of my new apartment. It is quiet here. Not the empty silence of a house waiting for a party, but the solid silence of a space that belongs entirely to me. I opened my laptop. On the screen was the spreadsheet I had maintained for 10 years. Family Records. It contained every loan, every bailout, every cover-up. It was a document of my own slavery. I didn't hesitate. I didn't feel a pang of nostalgia. I highlighted the file. Pressed delete. Then I went to the trash bin and clicked empty. The updates come through third parties now. Joshua and Angela are currently out on bail awaiting trial for felony embezzlement. The lakeside estate is bank-owned, stripped of its furniture, a hollow shell, just like the reputation they tried so hard to protect. They are bankrupt in every currency that matters. Isabella is working as a shift supervisor at a boutique in Brooklyn. She lives in a 4th-floor walk-up with a roommate. She sold the designer clothes. She deleted her influencer accounts. I saw her last week from a distance, walking down the street eating a bagel. She looked tired. She looked unpolished. She looked real. She is finally building a life that costs only what she can afford. And me. I am sitting here with a cup of coffee that tastes like freedom. I know there are people out there, maybe you, who are still holding on to the invisible chain. You are the fixer, the stabilizer, the one who absorbs the damage so the golden ones can shine. You stay because you are afraid of the guilt. You are afraid that if you stop rowing, the boat will sink and it will be your fault. But I am writing this to tell you something I wish someone had told me. There is a peace waiting for you on the other side of the bridge you burn. You think it will feel like a tragedy. It won't. It will feel like setting down a heavy pack you have been carrying up a mountain for a lifetime. You do not owe them your future just because they gave you a past. You do not owe them your solvency just because they gave you their name. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let them fall. Because as long as you are their cushion, they will never learn to stand. And as long as you are their shadow, you will never learn to shine. I took a sip of coffee. I looked out at the skyline. The view was expensive. But for the first time in my life, the bill was paid in full. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to know they aren't alone. And don't forget to follow for more stories of truth and justice.